Well, hello and welcome to today's event. We are delighted that so many people from across this great country have joined us for a really important conversation and the release of some really consequential research and insights that we hope can make a big difference in helping to speed the gains across the system and help to deliver that strong shared ambition around really strong, empathetic and culturally capable service and responsiveness in the system. My name is Misha Schubert. I have the great privilege of being the CEO of the Super Members Council in our really important work to be a strong and effective voice for 12.5 million everyday Australians who have their super in profit to member super and to speak about the things that we still need to do to bring to life the full promise of super right across the Australian community. It's my very great privilege to be able to facilitate a conversation. I'm going to hand to Sonia Hunyadi in a minute just to give a few housekeeping commentary. But as we do in this country, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the country and the elders across our country, this remarkable continent who keep law and language and knowledge and culture strong through the ages. I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal Ngambri country here in the nation's capital. The word Canberra actually derives from a Ngunnawal word, Canberra, meeting place, which feels very fitting every time we gather communities as part of the super system across this great land to ground ourselves in the long story of tradition making in this country, to pay our shared respects to elders throughout that long continuity of time in this place who have held knowledge tight and safe through all of those spans of human history in this continent and who today continue to play that crucial leadership role with generosity and grace, helping our country to deal with the harder parts of our shared story, to think about our own personal and organisational responsibilities in the work of repair and that stewardship that we all bring to that task, and helping us to forge that future together. We're really delighted that two luminous leaders have given us the great honour of sharing their leadership with us today as part of the conversation that we'll have about this report and its findings and the pieces of work that we need to do next. So, of course, both of them will be very well known to many across our community in the super system and beyond. The amazing Leah Bennett is, of course, a proud Wiradjuri and Nyampa woman. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the First Nations Foundation, and we're really always so pleased to work in close partnership and trusted partnership of mutual reciprocity on these important topics. It's, of course, the Foundation is Australia's only national Indigenous financial literacy organisation that works at that scale across the organisation, and we're really grateful for Leah's leadership. She's served as a director on their board for a long period and now in the CEO role and carrying its work forward into the next incarnation. And of course, Dr. June Smith is a proud Gurindji woman. She's an ethicist and lawyer. She's got a PhD in law, a string of degrees. She participates in many of the leadership forums around ethical leadership in our community and indeed in the sort of trans-Tasman connections between ombudsmen around the country. She's the Deputy Chief Ombudsman of the Australian Financial Complaints Authority and plays a role in many other sort of judicial bodies, quasi-judicial bodies across the architecture of our community as well, including on the National Sports Tribunal and the Victorian Racing Tribunal. We are in for a really important conversation. So firstly, thank you, June, and to Leah for your leadership consistently on so many of these important pieces of work. I'm going to hand briefly to Sonia Hunyadi, who's going to step us through some housekeeping, and then we're going to present the key findings out of this important research and then into a facilitated panel discussion with us on what it's found and what the pieces of work are that we need to do next. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Misha. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and also pay my respects to elders past and present. So in terms of housekeeping, the chat and hands up functions have been disabled, so please post any questions you have in the Q&A box. We've set some time aside for Q&A towards the end of today's webinar. This report will be available on SMC's website for you to read at your leisure, and this presentation is also being recorded and will be on our website should you want to invite colleagues to watch the session at a later time. Thanks, Misha.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sonia. I also want to acknowledge that any piece of work that any of us do builds on a really long and storied trajectory of other people's contributions, leadership, and work. And I think we've joined today by others who've played a really important role in some of the major pieces of research across recent years, in addition to the First Nations Foundation and the work that AFCA have done. I also want to acknowledge the work that Super Consumers Australia and Mob Strong Debt produced last year, another really important and consequential piece of work that illuminated insights that can help to guide our shared collective work and leadership on these important issues. So, Sonia, why don't we hand to you to give us a quick run through the content of the report, and then we'll have a conversation.
Thank you, Misha. I'm hoping you can all see that presentation now. Yep, excellent. See nods. So, the report. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we will discuss the landscape and report methodology, the report's purpose, and we'll cover some statistics and context, as well as some key findings, system level reforms, and actions super funds can take today. In 2025, two major reports were published discussing service experiences in super for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members, and Misha touched on this earlier. So the first report was ASIC's Report 806, Taking Ownership of Death Benefits, which reviewed claims handling by 10 super trustees. And the second report was Super Consumers Australia and Mob Strong Debt Help, also publishing a report, Building Futures Not Barriers, which focused on First Nations people's experiences with super funds and government departments. Both reports highlighted deficiencies in the provision of super-related services to First Nations members. The findings reinforced the urgency for strong uplift in cultural capable leadership and service experiences. That's why SMC undertook its own complementary study to identify and share what SMC member funds were genuinely doing well and how systems were evolving post these two reports to better serve First Nations members. So to do this, SMC undertook research with 6 member funds representing approximately 7.5 million Australians to explore issues of service in greater depth. The purpose of the report was to document this better practice and enable it to be shared and adopted across the super sector. So these findings aren't theory. They are policies and processes that flow onto operational experiences that funds are doing today. By distilling principles and lessons from funds that are leading this work, SMC hopes the report provides a foundation for sector-wide uplift in service standards, as well as opening the door for broader regulatory and legislative reform to support consistent, fairer experiences for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The report provides some background and stats into the super experiences of First Nations peoples. We know that on average, First Nations peoples earn about 30% less than non-Indigenous Australians, leading longer term to lower super balances than others in the population. Between 2002 and 2022, SG coverage rose for most Australians from 85% to 92%, but in the same period it rose only 70% to 78% for First Nations peoples. The median super balance in 2022 was 70,000 for non-Indigenous people and only 28,000 for First Nations members. Around 85% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in major cities or inner and outer regional areas. So while not every Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person is in a vulnerable situation due to remoteness, you can see there is still ingrained disparity across the system. And we know when super funds have processes in place that support the most vulnerable of their members, it uplifts the experiences for all members. Now on to key findings. The first step to better practice is that leadership and executive buy-in is the difference between good intentions and real change. When the board and the CEO back this work, it becomes visible, resourced, and embedded. So it's not dependent on individual good people, but becomes how the organisation operates. Leadership buy-in supports staff to make flexible, risk-based decisions, and it enables faster, more compassionate processes that are innovative. And when funds do it well, leaders show up. A specific example in one fund was that executive buy-in to outreach was stronger when senior executives attended and witnessed community outreach firsthand. So leaders modelling what matters. This may not be possible for all funds to do, but starting with training in this area will expand understanding. So the message is pretty simple. If we want better service experience for First Nations members, we can't treat this as a niche initiative. It's an organisation-wide change, and that only happens when leaders actively own it. One of the strongest findings in this report is that cultural safety in super is foundational to better service experiences. Cultural safety is not just awareness, it's how the fund behaves across every touch point. Leadership matters, as we've already discussed, so does building cultural capability across the whole organisation. All interviewed funds provide cultural awareness training to at least frontline staff, but better practice occurs where training is delivered from board level down. The point is consistency. Members should get the same culturally safe experience whether they're dealing with frontline staff, claims teams, or leaders. Better practice also engaged with community outreach. Funds described fund agnostic outreach and partnerships with local community groups as crucial to building trust with First Nations members. Face-to-face engagement helps overcome remoteness, digital exclusion, and communication gaps. And fund agnostic support during outreach works best when those who are on the ground can refer people to escalation points in other funds to get them the targeted help they need. And finally, funds that were engaged in better practice included cultural safety into claims handling, especially death benefits. A key example is sorry business, which is a significant cultural practice around death. Funds that had a cultural understanding of sorry business could include these considerations in their death benefit claims processes, such as asking whether a family member would prefer to not use the deceased name, using an empathetic and risk-based approach to documentation such as death certificates, and placing internal system flags so processes don't unintentionally cause distress. And finally, cultural safety is reinforced through flexibility and discretion. Better practice consistently points to risk-based decision-making and empowering staff as better practice. Examples include accepting non-standard ID aligned to Austrac's guidance, with staff using judgment rather than a rigid checklist. Only requesting documentation that is truly necessary. So one fund assessed what documentation was critical and only asked for that, instead of defaulting to standard paper-heavy requirements. And better practice also occurred when funds adopted case-by-case claims decisions that weigh factors like complexity and claim size. Death benefit or hardship payments could then be expedited by using discretion-based decisions to reduce delays, while still balancing any type of fraud and compliance risk. And some funds use their community connections to find beneficiaries and verify key facts when standard processes couldn't assist. Some further practical support that reflected better practice in service standards included supporting the work of financial counsellors by understanding the important work they do and offering escalation points to assist with complex cases. Better practice also reflected funds using their existing data, such as postcode level data, to identify who their First Nations members are. Analysing postcodes, especially those in areas with significantly higher proportions of First Nations peoples, allows super funds to target service delivery. Simple English guides was another useful tool, which helps explain the super system using straightforward language and illustrations. The more simple English guides that are available, it will help understanding of the super system for all cohorts. And finally, support services on websites. Those funds that are supporting members, particularly any member in vulnerable circumstances, will have links to support services on their websites to assist those facing financial hardship. So these are examples of better practice. But the barriers to better service lie not just within the sector, but also within regulatory and legislative frameworks. The system can't improve services if funds don't know who their First Nations members are. So postcode level indicators help, but they're imperfect. That's why funds should adopt a sector-wide approach to culturally safe self-identification processes that are aligned to Indigenous data governance principles. Further, super law relies on narrow Western legal definitions of family, which don't recognise Indigenous kinship systems. That means culturally significant relationships can be excluded and trustees are constrained in their death benefit decision-making. This is why the report explicitly calls for legislative reform so super can recognise kinship and enable flexible nomination options. And finally, reform is needed because best efforts aren't enough. Relying on a few specialists or leaving capability to vary across outsourced providers leads to patchy outcomes. There needs to be clearer minimum expectations, supported by regulatory guidance, so cultural safety and service standards are consistent across the system, not dependent on which fund you're with or who picks up the phone. So, what can super funds do today? Train all frontline staff in cultural safety at a minimum with a pathway to organisation wide training. Empower staff to use discretion and make decisions in complex cases, backed by clear support and policies and processes. Use risk based, culturally informed frameworks such as Austrac's non standard guidance on ID. Add clear referral links on websites for hardship support, like the National Debt Helpline, Centrelink, financial counsellors, and community services. Collaborate across funds via escalation networks to support those funds that can do outreach and help them resolve issues out in community quickly. And join forums, either informally or formally, to help share information and practices, including case studies. So, closing message. Better services for First Nations members are a trustee responsibility, and leadership commitment at board and executive level is the critical enabler. When trustees set expectations, empower staff, and prioritise cultural safety, members' experiences are uplifted. While legislative reform is needed in some areas, trustees don't need to wait. These better practices we covered can materially reduce barriers today. Sustainable change requires system-wide collaboration and better data. So no single fund can solve this alone. Regulatory guidance and shared learning will also play a key role in supporting the collective action that will lift standards across the system. Thank you. Now back to you, Misha, for a panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for your work on this. And indeed, thank you to all of those who had contributed insights, who were willing to share some of the practices that they've been developing and really enhancing in recent years to speed the gains for others across the system as well. It's always terrific to see that strong, generous, collaborative leadership. And particularly thankful to you, Sonia, for leading those engagements for us and having those conversations indeed. Let's get into a conversation now. And we're really delighted to draw in Leah and June and to hear a few of your reflections at the outset. So I wondered if I could start particularly by inviting both of you, Leah and June, to just sort of reflect on that kind of arc of the content that Sonia's laid out and, how that reflects, how that's reflected, or is it indeed reflective of the things that you hear and see in your organisation's work in the communities?
Yeah,
Leah, why don't you go first?
oh, thank you. I was going to. Joking. First of all, obviously, thank you to the team at SMC, Sonia and Misha, and everyone else that was involved in creating this report. As I've said before, it's really great to see a report that backs our experiences out in community with mob. Um, it's been consistent information that we've seen for almost a decade now, but to be able to kind of see the work that super funds have put into improving services over that period of time is good to be incorporated in that report, which helps track the improvements being made, but shows that there's still a long way to go when it comes to mob interacting with the sector. But yeah, absolutely, it's definitely what we're seeing on the ground with community.
And June?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Leah. And look, I suppose from our perspective, we see in our complaints the types of matters that really go to how First Nations people are engaging with superannuation right at the moment. And if you think about it, the purpose of super is really to make sure that all Australians not only can understand superannuation but can access it. So as we're moving from accumulation in many funds as well towards many members who will be in pension phase and also transitions of systems in this industry, whether that's because of AI enablement or otherwise, what a great opportunity and what a great time to be thinking about and reflecting on. Is our service in superannuation really meeting super's purpose, and why? Why should it be different? Why should we look at and review how our superannuation service is tailored for First Nations people right now? And at AFCA, we've had to do that as well. And so if you think about it, all Australians really should know where their super is, how they can access it, uh, how it works, what entitlements they've got, and how they can get that money when they need it and the support they need. And I think Sonia and has just shown us in the report, and we all know it was Closing the Gap Day. I think it was yesterday. Everybody understands that there are many reasons why many First Nations people start with a disadvantage. And we'll get onto this probably a little later about awareness versus vulnerability. But if you think about it, we're only really in the second generation of First Nations people who even have had money and worked with Western institutions, including banks and super funds. And many people are having to navigate the intersection between their culture, between the values and the norms of that culture, and the Western way of doing things as well. So when we look at what things we're seeing in complaints, they really marry up with some of the closing the gap items. Aboriginal people have lower super balances. Aboriginal people have been victims of salary theft. Many times have not had pay receipts or salary receipts to understand where their super is. Aboriginal people suffer from more chronic illness. Their life expectancy is lower. Many people as well have imprisonment rates that are higher in the Aboriginal population than otherwise. Many people have different names in their community, in their mob, to what Western society expects of them. Often, for remote First Nations people, not access to birth certificates and details like that, and often rely on their community for their identity, who they are, where they fit in, who their family or their mob is, and what kinship structures they've got. So it's any wonder that our complaints, Misha, reflect that barriers to self-identifying. So, are you even dealing with an Aboriginal person? Who are you? And does your identification and who you feel and what you feel about your identity marry up to what we know about you in our system? When you say that a person is a member of your family, does that really reflect the very traditional definitions of family that we know even non-Indigenous families these days don't meet? And when you need access to death benefits, well, what's the hurry? What's this thing called sorry business? And why is it that you feel that you need access to the information about a superannuation account for a person that we don't even recognize as your family? And so these are the things and the barriers that we see in complaints. And it really plays out, I think, from the industry having to consistently now step back and think, what is the purpose of super? How can every Australian access it? And are there institutional, systematic, and other reasons why First Nations mob might have more difficulty than others? And what can we do about it?
Such a powerful exposition of all of those factors that contribute to people's lived experiences of the system. Thank you both so much for those opening kind of framing comments and for covering so much terrain in them both. One of the things that I think is really striking about this report is that it really hangs a big lantern over the role of leadership buy-in and support and active engagement around driving further uplift across the system. So I wondered, Leah, maybe first to you and then to June, when you think about that role of leadership, what does that look like in practice beyond an organisation perhaps having a strategy document and, that kind of messaging? What does it look like in a day-to-day sense at the institutional level and in people's sort of lived messaging across very large institutions in many cases?
Thanks, Misha. I think for me, and obviously very new into the position of CEO, is it's really ensuring that we're getting our communities and mobs stories across the line to ensure that organisations are well informed when it comes to how you're dealing directly with First Nations people, because at the end of the day, we sit somewhere as a bridge between the financial services sector and those communities. And so leadership for me is about how do I take those stories and the things that is being experienced on the ground and being able to support and help advocate for those experiences and those people. But then how do we also use that information to uplift and support the institutions in ensuring that they can better serve our communities?
Terrific. June, you've obviously thought about a lot about leadership in many of your guises and hats as well. How do you see good practice in terms of what leadership and that personal commitment from leaders looks like in a day-to-day sense?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I can share the AFCA story because that's probably a far more tangible example as well. So we had an opportunity to just look at service delivery. And we thought that that wasn't really getting at the why. Why did we want things to change in terms of our First Nations engagement? So we really went back to the reconciliation journey and the Uluru Statement, and we decided that what we really wanted to do was walk with First Nations people in relation to their purpose. So that meant relationships that were based on respect, that we wanted to understand and learn from the wisdom and the experience and the culture of First Nations people. When that came down to our business, that meant we had to look at recruitment, we had to look at procurement, we looked at our governance structures, we also looked at our strategy and who we were actually dealing with in order to deliver even what our purpose was and what we were trying to achieve. In terms of our whole objective around our engagement with First Nations people, that's about participating in economic empowerment. And so once you set that up as a goal, it's not just about how are you delivering service, it's actually about how are we going to embed in our business from the top down what we're really trying to achieve here. And for superannuation, the purpose is clear. All Australians having access to super. And then in our service delivery, how do we get to a tailored approach for First Nations people so they can actually engage in accordance with their cultural practice, whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through accepting and respecting identification and kinship norms, or whether or not that's understanding we're talking in different language. So the AFCA board, as everybody probably knows, has First Nations members. The AFCA board engages First Nations companies to engage in strategy and storytelling to take a holistic view. All board members are trained, and that's what we call awareness, and listen, and that's what we call community engagement. At Ops, we have Nigalimba. So that is an Indigenous story that tells us about our values, and our values are to walk with others towards resolution. Our symbols include our lanyards. They have Indigenous symbols on them, and that comes from Nigalimba as well. Everyone is culturally trained, and in leadership, we engage as well in storytelling. So storytelling has become one of our norms. Yarning. So everyone in circle, everyone has a same voice, first among equals. Visual aids as well. So not only the lanyards expressing our opinions, but also acknowledgements of country. So really role modeling those leadership matters as well. And then our KPIs reflect that that is what we need from people. See the person has become a normal value where we walk in the shoes of another person, listen and understand who they are before we act. So I think you can see even our leave entitlements reflect the fact that some First Nations people won't want to take Australia Day off because to them it's a day of mourning. Some First Nations people will need leave for sorry business. So this is about how to embed what we're looking to achieve. Respect for culture, walking with economic empowerment for Australians through an Australia free of financial complaints, and then embedding that throughout our business and the way in which we then serve First Nations people. It can be done, but it takes a top-down approach and it takes everyone understanding why are we doing this.
Thank you both for sharing so generously the experiences that you've clearly led inside your respective organisations as well, and that approach, both at the kind of strategy level and the leadership vision level, but also how that's then been operationalised to bring it to life for every member of staff across organisations and the stakeholders you engage with. I wondered if we could turn now to the parts of the report that really try to help illuminate where there's sort of further uplift required on kind of the cultural safety of service engagements. And Leah, can I start with you about just sort of teasing out some of those threads about what are the sort of small signals that perhaps members might pick up in any of those engagements that sort of signal to someone this doesn't feel really safe for me, and how can the system as a whole really understand how to send really important signals of trust and affirmation in every engagement that can help with landing that piece of that sort of foundation stone of the relationship and the engagement.
Yeah, thanks. I think two key things that come to mind um, is obviously not being respected during the interaction. So dealing with somebody and coming across as impatient as they process information, um, being condescending is a big one. Not allowing space for somebody to process their thoughts as you're talking to them. As we know, a lot of First Nations people may speak two, three, four languages. And so, really, just being patient with them as they're processing words that they probably don't hear every single day, like consolidation and, or the big fancy words. Um, it's really important that you remember who you're talking to in every situation. And so I myself worked within the superannuation sector for 5 years, and a part of my role was often monitoring phone call conversations and the experience more broadly, not just First Nations people, but people in general who would call up and be in a vulnerable situation and be on the phone to somebody and they really just don't understand what's going on and become overly frustrated. And, that's really, really difficult. And as we know, there's been that loss of trust within the sector between First Nations people. And so kindness and empathy just goes such a long way. Patience and understanding that whilst it might be frustrating for you as a frontline staff member, you are what represents that organization. And so embedding that competency and cultural competency as well in frontline staff to remember that it's not mob's fault that there is a lack of financial literacy or literacy even in general. So yeah, it really comes down to just allowing space for First Nations people to take time to process. Obviously, being really careful about how you speak to somebody, especially when we think about death benefit claims as an example of this, calling up during one of the most difficult times for an individual and any person, whether or not that's a child or a wife or the next of kin for an individual, to call up and have to talk about a deceased person is really, really challenging. And so if you're not met with empathy and compassion in those times, then that's what loses trust as well. Like, what's the point of calling back and trying to interact with, individuals? So for me, like the biggest improvement that needs to be made is just how we are dealing with people going through a difficult time and just allowing people to, yeah, process information in the way, or, how can I help you? Like, is there another way that I can phrase this to support this person? But that's generally probably where we see the most probably, yeah, where we would see the most opportunity to improve safety for First Nations people when interacting with the sector.
Yeah. Such a powerful call out for those roles of empathy, kindness, and holding space for people's experiences and going in a time frame and pace that listens deeply to where people are at and sort of seeks to understand. I wondered if we could also draw out another really important part of the contents of this report between the two of you, and And that's really about sort of the distinction between cultural awareness and vulnerability. And I wondered if both of you might have some thoughts on why that distinction, what is that distinction? Why is it important to understand in complaints handling or decision making or indeed engagement? And how might people think about that in a more deeply informed or culturally capable way?
Mhm. Annie, June, do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
You can go.
Yeah, so for me, not all First Nations people are vulnerable, right? To the same degrees in which we would classify, somebody to be vulnerable. And I think we also miss opportunity to support people who are vulnerable that don't fit within the buckets that you think they should. So one of the things that was highlighted in this report was around identifying First Nations members through postcodes, which is a great starting point. But the reality is that the vast majority of our communities are living within metropolitan areas that still would actually be considered vulnerable, that are missing opportunity for support. Um, just because you're an Aboriginal person doesn't make you vulnerable is the key thing. But I want to actually just take this back for a second, something that June had said. Um, First Nations people have not had access to the economy longer than we've had access to it. Some of us will own a home, some of us will own a business, but the vast majority of us will have superannuation. It's a mandatory system. And it's still a system that we're being locked out of, that we can't access, that we don't understand. And so it's not necessarily that we are vulnerable or that all First Nations people are vulnerable, but it's that we have a challenging time interacting with a system that was not created with us in mind. And so yeah, whilst it's easy to kind of slip us under that vulnerability legislation to say, yeah, we can do members' best financial interest and because we'll just whack them under there, it's far greater than that. Like it's about finally giving us the opportunity to like fully participate in the economy. Um, Even though we may pass away before we get access to it, it becomes a legacy for our family and the first opportunity for intergenerational wealth. And I think that's really important. So I think it's still, yeah, I mean, that it's still important to identify that there are First Nations people in vulnerable situations, but that doesn't mean that those that aren't in vulnerable situations don't deserve greater support in order to ensure greater economic participation.
Such a powerful answer. June.
Yeah, amazing, Leah, and very well said. And I think, Misha, I'd go back, as Leah has, to what we were saying at the start. Cultural awareness is really about understanding what the cultural norms of a particular group are, and from a position of strength and respect. And often I find when I'm dealing with organizations and they say to me, well, look, we're trying to help. We're trying to make sure that people have got access. We understand there's vulnerability, there's digital exclusion, there's this, that, and the other thing. And I often wonder, the relationship is bound to fail because the first thing I don't hear is a true respect for what could be learnt even from that culture, the strengths of that culture and where it is coming from. And so cultural awareness for me is really about understanding and seeing that person and stepping into their shoes. What is their worldview? And how do I engage in that worldview? So if that culture has different ways of thinking about family, if that culture has different understandings of identity and how identity is represented, if that culture has different ways of communicating, whether that's the space that Leah has talked about, or the written word, or an oral way of storytelling, then Am I changing my system to accommodate that? Or am I expecting that group to fit into my worldview? That's cultural awareness. And unless you understand that culture, where it has come from, and that would include mistrust. Why is it that Aboriginal people would not be readily trusting of a white institution and want to engage with it through its ways? Well, that would be because history tells us that for hundreds of years, that has led to incredibly poor outcomes for Aboriginal people. And so vulnerability is very different. And some of the factors I talked about before, whether that's chronic illness, mental health, imprisonment, whether that's low levels of literacy, they are factors that make us all vulnerable, do they not? Including First Nations people. But there is a frame of reference where you think that everyone from a particular group is vulnerable just because of who they are, versus understanding that they are different because they have different ways of living to you and practicing to you. And we have learnt so much from storytelling, from oral storytelling. We have learnt so much from this concept of space and just giving people time, even with our own staff. And so I would say to everyone on the call today, stop and listen first and think and reflect on what you can. Are you engaging with First Nations people and even in this conversation today from a position of respect? Or have you already started this conversation by we have to change our service delivery and our systems because other people are not up to engaging in the system as it is? It's a really different way of seeing the world.
Um, Thank you for both articulating, those life circumstances that feed into that kind of, startup of the engagement as well, in those answers that you've both just given there, and the ways in which we can all be thinking about how to lift practice there. It's like you've both intuited a question that we've just had into the chat, where the question is sort of, it feels like in some respects, what we're seeing still today is, trying to find better ways for First Nations members to meet the institutions and the architecture where it is, rather than thinking about what does, a redesigned process look like in many instances. And if we were to ask First Nations members directly across the country in all the diversity of experiences, what would be an easy measure of success, or a good measure of success that could indicate if we were making further big strides towards that goal of that sort of deeply culturally responsive practice that you both just described. I am conscious that we are very close to time, so I wondered if we can, as we sort of start to draw the conversation together, just invite you both to maybe think about if there is one clear message that each of you wanted to telegraph to the system as a whole, or about, what you think needs to be the sort of mindset and approach going forward. What's the one thing that you think could make the biggest, most consequential difference to further ambitious uplift here? Yeah.
Annie, June and I caught up yesterday and we both agreed that consistency is important. So I'll let June talk about that. I don't think there's one singular thing. I think a greater presence of First Nations voices within organisations. Nothing about us without us, right? And there is such a severe underrepresentation within superannuation of First Nations people that are actually contributing to the conversation. So I know that there's a number of organisations that have surveyed staff to see, what their employment rates are. But that's only meaningful if those voices are heard, if they're a part of the conversations that are shaping our future. And to me, this is a huge one, and I see a lack of First Nations support within the sector. So here we are, First Nations people saying nothing about us without us. Like, engage us in conversation, make sure we're in the room. That also supports you as an organization. It builds competency internally, and confidence within individuals around that the decisions that they're making are actually benefiting community. And then we're not always available to come to the table to have those conversations. So organizations like First Nations Foundation, FCA, Mobstrong, we're all under so much pressure. But there are a lot of really incredible First Nations consultants out there. So if you're not looking to employ a full-time person in your organization to help, there is opportunity to hire consultants that can have a greater presence within your organization that can help shift and shape the operations of an organization. So we're also, as we've I think announced in November at the ASFA conference as well, doing some work with Yamagigu to provide an industry handbook. And so it would be to the senior leaders within those organizations that your support behind this piece of work is essential. That there is that consistency that June will talk about across the industry, but that is also the voices of First Nations people that will be embedded in your operations, that will be guided by people who have expertise within superannuation industry, First Nations people that understand culture and understand community and the issues. And so my call out to all senior management within superannuation funds is to please ensure that once the industry handbook is released, that it is embedded within your organisation to support all First Nations people.
Such an important call to action, and thank you for your leadership on that work, Claire, and to you and your team for thinking about how to systematise and wash through the benefits of so many important pieces of work that have been done. And now the opportunity to bring it together in a more joined up way to get that sort of consistency that we've that's spoken about through the course of the conversation today. June, can we hand to you for a similar kind of closing set of thoughts on where we might go from here and the things that you want people to take away and carry in their heads and their hearts as they leave today's event?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thank you for the opportunity. And we all recognise and understand that there are many trustees out there who are doing some great work in this area on an individual basis. If there's one message from today, other than financial counsellors are your best friend, as are money mob workers. So if you don't have a system to allow money mob workers and financial counsellors to walk with your First Nations members, have a think about that. But I'd say embrace the report and understand what it's trying to tell you. And what it's trying to tell you is you've got a fantastic opportunity as you transition with your administrators and life insurers anyway, your systems, processes, and ways of working as you move from accumulation of pension, as you modernize your frameworks, to think about equity. When you lift one, you lift everyone. And so consistency across this sector, walking together and working together to lift one will lift everyone. So embrace this report and what it's telling you about how you can actually do that at a time when your businesses are already thinking about the transition of how you deliver service to Australians to ensure that every Australian can access their super and meaningfully engage in their retirement and their lifestyle. Economic empowerment should be the objective for us all.
Such a powerful exhortation on which to wrap up today's event. Can I take this opportunity to thank both of you, Dr. June Smith and Leah Bennett, for your remarkable leadership in this system, for generously and graciously sharing your insights, leadership, and your vision for how we can continue to do these pieces of work. I feel like we've barely touched the size of this conversation. to sort of those other matters of law reform and other things that we know are also on our shared to-do lists for the system, including kinship recognition in law and some of those other parts of the system levers that we know are really important. For anyone who hasn't yet had a chance, the report will be being distributed today. So please engage with the material. Again, I want to say thank you to Sonia Hunyadi and to the teams that Leah and June led as well for providing insights and important partnership around that work. To all of you who may have contributed to those insights, thank you for sharing your practice and leadership as well. This work is so important. It's important to me. It's important to the sector and the organisations that each of us hail from, I know. So thank you everyone for coming and re-engaging with this really important set of thematics and calls to action. We're really, really looking forward to working even further in the next year and years ahead on how we can continue to drive further progress on these issues.